You know what's always fun for me? When you get a show that's been around for a while and you compare the early days to what the show would become. And I'm not talking about a show necessarily declining or getting better. I'm talking about a complete transformation. Just off the top of my head, let's look at Family Matters. It started out as a simple sitcom about a black middle-class family dealing with everyday issues, all very down to earth. And then...
Hi, Mr. Winslow. I'm Steve Urkel.
And indeed, one of those shows, believe it or not, is Yugioh. Or maybe you can believe it because, well, one thing that gets talked about a lot is what's dubbed by anime fans as Season 0. It's one of those aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! That's talked about quite a bit, but not a lot of people have seen it outside of the hardcore Yu-Gi-Oh! Fandom. But it tends to get a lot of strange hype. Those who talk about Season 0 talk about it as if it was this hyper-violent show, where Yugi was basically Jigsaw going around murdering people in all sorts of death games. And yes, not just card games. And it's often been said that the season was so violent that 4Kids refused to release it in the States. Wow, this must be one insane show. Surely this must be one of the darkest shonen anime ever made. Oh boy, here we go.
Hi, my name is Papari Monlo. Get up!
Yeah, no. Hate to burst a lot of clickbait bubbles out there, but Season 0 is not the murder fest you expected. Also, it's not really a Season 0. It's a different series, aired on a different channel, and you know what, let me get into the story. If you know the baseline of Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's basically the same here. A high school boy named Yugi Moto finds an ancient Egyptian puzzle, known as the Millennium Puzzle, and upon solving it, he is possessed by a powerful alternate personality who competes against various enemies in life or death shadow games. And the familiar cast is here with, warning for the sake of not mixing up names, I'm gonna be using the cast's US names. Don't get your weeaboo kitty panties in a twist. Hyugi, Joey, Taya, Grandpa Moto, who may have not been worth saving, Kaiba, Bakura, Tristan, and Miho. What, you don't remember Miho? How dare you? Miho has been there till the very end. Look! Okay, so maybe not. Miho started off as a one-off character in the manga who was the object of Tristan's affections, and soundly rejected him because, well, he's Tristan. I'm guessing they wanted to balance out the cast more and go for that whole 3 boys, 2 girls dynamic, but unfortunately she doesn't really get to do much. She's cute, she's bubbly, and she does have her fun moments, but she doesn't get to add a lot. In fact, ironically, because Tristan simps on her constantly throughout the show, it gives Tristan more personality as a result. She's not offensively bad, trust me, this franchise has had worse team members, but I can't call her my favorite exactly. And alas, she's limited to this series, leaving Tristan all alone to simp for a blind girl.
The Kaiba Corporation is streaming the Battle City tournament live on the internet. I thought we'd watch Joey's next duel together.
Tristan, I can't.
Oops.
You twat.
Something you've probably also noticed by now is the animation style. While the series everyone knows was produced by Studio Gallop, Season 0 was produced instead by Toei Animation, one of the largest animation studios in Japan, producing some of the biggest name anime shows ever and oftentimes being a breeding ground for talent that would go on to become big names in the industry, sometimes producing absolutely groundbreaking, amazing animation, and then oftentimes creating some stuff that looks pretty bad. From borderline incomplete background, to wonky faces and in-betweens, to... Is that a poorly cut out JPEG? You never quite know what you'll get from Toei. Sometimes even the same director can produce absolutely gorgeous animation, and then a couple episodes later produce some truly hideous stuff. Season 0 in comparison, however, is definitely a lot more consistently animated. Characters are a lot more on models, save for the occasional odd spot, but at the same time, there's not as many big popping moments. Especially compared to the later series where movements have more bounce and weight to them. Now where the show truly gets to shine, however, is the style and cinematography of the animation itself. The color scheme is immediately striking, using a lot of heavily contrasting bold colors and pure black or purple shadows that produces a really intense look when the shadow games get going. Though it does lead to some interesting choices, like I think this is the only anime where the girls' school uniforms are orange, and the less said about Kaiba's green hair, the better. There's also some pretty ambitious cinematography every so often, with some funky angles, lighting, and framing such as the moving camera every so often done without CGI, which is pretty impressive given that this was probably made on a tight budget. And you also get some exaggerated expressions kinda like Toei's Sailor Moon adaptation at that time that really adds some life. It goes to show you that while Toei are definitely a cheap studio, they're not a lazy studio. Along with the different animation studio, we also have a different voice cast. They are mostly fine. No one really does a bad job though, there's no one especially notable, with one massive exception. Megumi Ogata as both Yugi and Yami. She's probably one of the most noteworthy voice actresses in Japan and she does an incredible job here. Her normal Yugi voice is absolutely wonderful, giving a lot of life to the little guy, and does a great job emphasizing his innocence to a lot of what's going on.
これってさ、二人きりって、入場券を買わないと。僕買ってくる。学生二人、お願いします。
学生一人と子供一人ですね。
子供って誰？
坊や、小学生は子供料金でいいのよ。
死刑だな。僕は俺はこう見えても高校生。
Meanwhile, her Yami Yugi voice takes advantage of her slightly androgynous voice to produce a very mysterious and calm tone. You really get a feeling just from his voice that Yami is always one step ahead of his opponent and is a wonderful contrast to normal Yugi.
今度は俺に爆弾のある場所を指定させろ。そうしたらお前がどこにいるか当ててやる。
君面白いね。いいよ。だけどルールは今まで通りね。風船飛ばして。
飛ばす風船の色は白だ。
While Dan Green will always be my favorite interpretation of this character, not gonna lie, I wish at least for the sub that Megumi kept doing the voice. It really works with the character, especially this early version of him. And all of his murdering! Okay, for real, let's talk about the thing everyone knows with Season 0, the fact Yugi has a body count. As mentioned before, there aren't as many card games this time around, though they are still the most recurring game. Each episode with their, Jerk of the Week, Yami challenges them to some kind of game that can be anything from a game dealing with the themes of that episode, to a twisted version of some kind of classic game or toy, ranging from a really inventive take on the game of Nim with roses, to Tamagotchi battles! And the Tamagotchis look like this. And when Yami's opponent loses, they get punished in ironic ways for what they did in the episode. A woman cheats at a pageant and knocks out one of the participants, hallucinates to think her youth and beauty have been sucked away, a bully treating people like pets, have his virtual pet eat him alive, a guy tries to steal a watch from Tristan, have his body slowly turning into watches and gears. Not gonna lie, it's pretty dang fun, but despite this, I should clarify, all of these are illusions created by Yami, not him actually killing them. Even the iconic scene of a convict being set on fire is all in his head. Honestly, Yugi had a bigger body count in Season 1, and that aired on American Saturday morning TV alongside actual horror cartoons. And yeah, it is darker, but honestly, the whole tone of the show doesn't make it a dark show. In fact, a lot of the time it feels like a slice of life anime with a death game at the end, where our plucky little characters have some wacky fun only to be ruined by, say, a terrorist bombing. Though I gotta say, it is really fun to see some aspects that would become important factors later on here. You get hints about the puzzle's Egyptian origins, the birth of Yugi and Kaiba's rivalry and on-off friendship, and because the manga was at Duelist Kingdom at this point, we even get an early appearance of Serenity, as well as an early hint that Joey has a thing for older women. It's also kind of funny seeing how the later anime had to make up for not adapting these stories for the later series. Remember the first appearance of Yami Bakura and the duel where the cast were turned into their favorite cards? That was a substitute for Yami Bakura's first appearance where they were put into Dungeons & Dragons figurines. Even mentioning Zork for the first time, minus his dragon penis. Episode 3 of the later anime also had to readapt some of the first episode to clue viewers on what happened. And probably the biggest one, the first episode is a combination between Kaiba and Yugi's first duel and their rematch. Speaking of, All Cabbage Head is where most of the card game action comes from in this show, which gets a lot of episodes dedicated towards it compared to the manga, when it only popped up twice before Duelist Kingdom. Once for Yugi's first duel with Kaiba, and then for their rematch. And it does raise a good question. Why did Yu-Gi-Oh become less about these wacky death games and more so about the card games? It wasn't the most original setup, but for a shonen anime, it does stand out. Why the change? And hell, how could Toei, one of the biggest animation studios in Japan, who merch the hell out of whatever property they get, fail to capitalize on such a money generator like Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, I have a theory. And granted, that's all it is, just a theory, but hear me out. The problem with Season 0 is that it's a lot more episodic in how it tells the story, rather than a continuous story like what we get later. Now, it's not like episodic storytelling can't work for something like this. Cowboy Bebop and Spy X Families are two good examples, but those either have a lot more variety between the episode plots, or the plot is developing subtly across these seemingly unrelated episodes. With Season 0, there are light sprinklings of plot threads throughout, but there's not really a looming plot or goal. There's the question of who the spirit of the puzzle is, but that gets barely addressed. There is Kaiba seeking his revenge by sending people to challenge Yugi, but they feel almost like filler. Probably because a lot of it was made strictly for the anime. And plot-critical elements in the manga where major characters were introduced got reworked into filler episodes, along with all sorts of weird shuffling and reworking of episodes. Some of it works, like the water park bomb puzzle is a lot more intense and has a better payoff than the manga equivalent. But the chapter where Joey rejoins his old gang, which was very emotional and intense and had a pretty brutal game, gets swapped out for killer yo-yos, which happened in a later chapter and doesn't work with this plotline. I can't imagine diehard Yu-Gi-Oh fans watching the show appreciated all these unnecessary changes and additions at the time. Another important thing to note is that the card game did a lot for Yu-Gi-Oh as a whole narratively. That provides one of the driving forces of the story. As mentioned before, it introduced Seto Kaiba and his rivalry with Yugi that provided one of the driving forces of the story. It introduced a lot more lore into the world of Yu-Gi-Oh where everything ties in rather nicely. And it also gave us a big overarching plot thread in each arc that just made for more interesting storytelling. Characters went through development and questions were being answered surprisingly thanks to the card game. And as mentioned before with Season 0, there isn't as much of that. I'm guessing they added the extra episodes with Kaiba to give this series that overarching plotline, but it doesn't really work and feels more like padding. Plus, with a card game anime, it's a lot easier to pace things out with extra turns and plays, which not only can feel thematically more intense, but the viewer can also pick up what goes into the game, how to play along, give a sense of power scaling, pick up strategies, and try out the cards and play with the real life cards at your local collectible shop, available now by Konami! I guess this is to say Yu-Gi-Oh! The manga just didn't translate that well in first anime. Maybe with the right production crew and studio this could have worked, but I'm not surprised this didn't turn out well. Toei dropped it after one season, and the only release of the show came out on VHS in Japan. I'm guessing the disappointing ratings as well as legal complications that come with a different production companies were more so the reason as well for this not getting a stateside release. Violence, I imagine 4Kids could have handled. Remember, they had to dub One Piece, which has way worse content with scenes like this, this, oh yeah, and this. Now that being said, I'm probably making it seem like I don't like the show, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. As its own little anime and a curiosity for Yu-Gi-Oh fans, it's still a lot of fun. I'm just putting into context why Season 0 didn't take off, and why it was dropped by Toei, as well as explaining why the more card game-centric storyline did take off. If you like yourself some slice-of-life anime mixed in with some fantastical elements, then you'll like this pretty well. And now that Konami is in charge of US distribution of the show and seems to be easing up on more loyal releases, I think it'd be cool if they brought this over and possibly even do an English dub. It's unlikely given the before mentioned legal rights, but hey, if Funimation can release the Ocean dub of Dragon Ball Z on a big collector set, I don't see why Season 0 can't get a similar treatment. You can find uploads of the show on places like YouTube and the Internet Archive, so definitely give it a watch and let me know what you think in the comments.
俺と美穂ちゃんはまだ結婚前そんな不純異性行為を美穂ちゃんにさせるなんて
Tristan, stop it.